Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry. We'll share how a research-based approach to analytics can empower your forestry organization to make better decisions with your data. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast today. I want to thank you for listening. This is my fourth month doing these, and I hope you found them valuable. I've been trying to do one every 2 weeks, and on that pace, it seems like folks are listening, and I've gotten feedback, and folks are enjoying what they're hearing, so I do appreciate you listening. I do want to also mention, someone asked about the name of the podcast, the Forest Analytics Landing. And the name of the podcast and kind of where it came from, it's basically the same, almost the same name as my email newsletter, which I call The Landing. And it's a newsletter on forest analytics and mostly contains some of the posts I write, some of the other things going on in my world. And so I encourage you, if you haven't subscribed to that, to subscribe to that. And so the podcast is basically the same name as the newsletter that I have. And I also think that The Landing is a bar in northern Wisconsin and probably in many other small towns where forestry and logging is an important resource to that region. So a common name among the forestry world. Anyway, on to today's topic. I want to talk about carbon credits today. I know that I've posted and have talked on forest carbon credits quite a bit over the last year. Especially as carbon credits have become more valuable to folks in the forestry industry, as timber owners, forest land owners are thinking of enrolling their lands in forest carbon credits. And specifically today, I want to talk about the quality and the quantity of carbon credits. And really the inspiration for this is a Bloomberg article that appeared last month in March of 2022 that really questioned a lot of the ongoing methods and how some of the carbon credits are valued and quantified in the markets today. And so certainly a lot going on with carbon credits, with new carbon programs, especially new voluntary carbon programs, seeking to capitalize on the value of trees and forests as natural capital solutions. And so this was also inspiring because last week there was news of the state of Washington in the United States entering 10,000 acres of their school trust lands into a carbon project. And so I think that's a real big reflection of a lot more diverse landowners jumping into carbon markets, including those state-owned lands through those school trust lands. And so a lot of opportunities exist for landowners to enter into these markets. I specifically want to focus on this idea of quality versus quantity. And so when we think about the quality of markets, of credits that go into markets, it's really about how valuable those credits are relative to other factors like the costs of management, like the costs of harvest reduction. And so when we think about the quantity of measurements of the quantity of carbon credits, we think about, how much, tons could an existing property produce given kind of compared to some baseline. And so I mentioned the Bloomberg article, and this was pointed out, and there's the CEO of Lime Timber Company. And so for some perspective, Lime Timber Company owns about 1.6 million acres of forest in the U.S., and they have about 200,000 of those acres currently enrolled in carbon markets. And so this article in Bloomberg interviews Jim Hordequin, who's the CEO of Lime Timber Company, who's really bringing about the issues and some of the things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to the quality versus quantity of carbon credits. And so I first came across that article last month and then realized that he gave a presentation, an excellent presentation on this, which I'll link to, that focuses on carbon offset markets and some of these evolving carbon markets. And it's really from a TIMO's perspective, or a Timber Investment Management Organization's perspective on carbon offsets and markets. And this presentation was delivered at the World Forestry Center's conference back in late 2021. So in that, in combination with the Bloomberg article, bringing about a lot of things that we ought to be thinking about when it comes to carbon credits. And so he certainly, in the article, he mentions a lot of the drawbacks to some of the carbon programs. And so, for example, a carbon program that operates on a harvest deferral model kind of operates with the assumption that payments are going to be made to the landowner, and then the landowner is going to forego something like timber harvesting, and then that payment would potentially be paid to store that carbon that otherwise would have been harvested. And so the Hordequin really points out that there's speculation that payments that are made to the landowner, they're being made for actions they're not planning to do anyway. And so he brings that up, and he offers a really funny analogy saying that it's not quite like that. And he says, quote, it's like paying to enter a beer hall, then enjoying a fine meal, but then finding out that they ran out of beer. And so it's a pretty interesting take on the world of carbon markets and some of these models that markets are operating today. So he goes on to mention in the presentation that the 100-year compliance framework, and so that's what's typical in the California Air Resources Board's compliance offset program, that the costs for the carbon being paid don't fully cover the costs for the timberlands. And so when you think about the management that goes into the timberlands, when you think about the reduction in harvest that's lost, how can we quantify that true value of carbon, which Hordequin does in some of the case studies that he presents. For some perspective, if you look at the voluntary markets now, carbon prices are anywhere between like $5 and $13 per metric ton. And so that's quite a bit lower than the regulatory markets. And so at least as of late last year, the price at auction for some of the California Air Resources Board projects was going for about $28 a metric ton. And so it's important to have those numbers into perspective, especially as I talk about some of the case studies. In those case studies, Hordequin presented 3 different ones for his company's lands. And so he has 3 case studies, one in Michigan, Florida, and West Virginia. And so the primary findings for these was that the price of carbon was considerably higher than those market values after taking into account the whole harvest reductions in addition to forest management obligations that the company would have. And so in Michigan, he mentions this was a forest type and a region that had a long history of timber harvesting. And he calculated, or their company calculated, the true cost of carbon being $60 a ton. Again, in Florida, another case study, these are some forests in his company that are actually under conservation easement. And so he found that the true cost of carbon was $50 a ton. And then for West Virginia, these forests are currently enrolled in the California Air Resources Board regulatory program. His ultimate decision or ultimate analysis found that the true cost of carbon was $30 a ton. And so when you can begin to compare what that true cost of carbon is after taking into account management, obligations, harvest reductions, it's quite a bit higher than some of the current rates being paid for carbon, at least in markets today. And so when it comes to kind of valuing the quality and the quantity of these markets, and of these credits from these markets, the primary conclusions are that really at those low prices, the quantity for carbon credits will generally be preferred instead of quality. However, there are a lot more people entering into the carbon credit buying world. When you think about corporations that are instituting environmental, social, and governance investing principles into their everyday work. If those buyers of those carbon credits are willing to pay, there could be additional opportunities for focusing on quality credits that reflect the true value of carbon. And so as an example, in the case studies that Hordequin provided in Michigan, Florida, and West Virginia, those could be 3 case studies where we might think about if the cost of carbon, the payments for the carbon, took into account all of those costs, then we might consider those a high quality credit. And potentially if there are buyers for those, they could have more justification and confidence in that being a high quality credit. And so for some perspective, I think Jim Hortigan's thoughts on this are great. I think they're really important for anyone in the forestry industry to understand and to kind of listen to his perspective. There are a lot of carbon credits available today. When you think about, in the U.S., there's over 800 million acres of forests, and a lot of carbon programs are going after them. And so understanding the quality of these credits is going to be needed to better understand the role that forests play as natural capital solutions when it comes to valuing our trees and our forests today and into the future. So that's it. Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com.